The crack of Victoria Ashford's palm against the pregnant waitress's cheek echoed through the wedding hall like a gunshot, and when Elena Brooks stumbled backward, one hand flying to her belly, 300 guests turned just in time to watch Alexander Hale, the most feared man on the eastern seaboard, rise from his seat at the altar and do something that would destroy everything he'd spent 20 years building. The champagne flute slipped from Elena's fingers. It shattered against the marble floor, sending shards skittering across the polished stone like scattered diamonds. The sound should have been small, insignificant beneath the soaring ceilings of the Hale Estate ballroom. Instead, it rang out in the sudden silence like a second assault. Eleanor's head had snapped to the right. Her cheek burned with a heat that spread down her neck and into her chest. She could feel every single gaze in that room land on her at once. 300 pairs of eyes. 300 witnesses to her humiliation. Politicians. Business moguls. Men and women whose names appeared in headlines and whose decisions moved markets, all of them watching a pregnant waitress stumble in her worn shoes while a woman in a $12,000 gown stood over her like a queen surveying a servant who had forgotten her place. Victoria Ashford kept her hand raised for a moment longer than necessary. The gesture was deliberate, theatrical. She wanted everyone to see, wanted them to understand that she could do this, that she had the power to strike a pregnant woman in front of the most influential gathering on the eastern seaboard, and no one would stop her. Her expression held no rage. That was the part that would haunt Elena later. There was no heat in Victoria's eyes, no flash of uncontrolled anger, only cold satisfaction, the calm certainty of a woman who believed the world existed to serve her whims. "You don't belong here," Victoria said. Her voice carried effortlessly across the silent hall. She had been trained for rooms like this, trained to project without shouting, to command attention without raising her tone. And neither does that. Her gaze dropped to Elena's stomach, to the visible curve beneath the simple black uniform. 6 months of hope and fear and desperate planning, reduced to a single word, that, as if the child growing inside her was an object, an inconvenience, a stain on the pristine aesthetic of the evening. Elena's left hand moved instinctively to cover her belly. Her right hand hung at her side, trembling slightly, though whether from shock or from the effort of not raising it in return she could not say. The sting on her cheek had faded to a dull throb. The humiliation burned far hotter. It spread through her veins like poison, urging her to shrink, to apologize, to do what she had always done when powerful people reminded her of her place. She opened her mouth. The words were already forming. "I'm sorry. I'll leave. Please, I need this job." But something stopped her. Maybe it was the baby. Maybe it was the memory of her mother working 3 jobs and never once bowing her head. Maybe it was simply the fact that she had reached the limit of what one person could absorb in a single lifetime, and Victoria Ashford had just pushed her past it. Elena closed her mouth. She straightened her spine. She did not apologize. The room remained frozen. Guests in silk and diamonds stood like statues, champagne glasses suspended halfway to their lips. Armed security and tailored suits lined the walls, hands clasped in front of them, trained to respond to threats but utterly unprepared for this. The string quartet had stopped mid-note, bows hovering above strings, the final chord still hanging in the air like a held breath. No one moved. No one spoke. No one intervened. Because no one wanted to be the person who challenged Victoria Ashford. Not here. Not at this wedding. Not when the woman she had just struck was nobody. A waitress. A temporary worker hired for the night and paid in cash. Someone who would disappear by morning and never be seen again. Victoria smiled. The expression was small, private, meant only for Elena, a victor acknowledging a defeated opponent. She lowered her hand slowly, smoothing it over the fabric of her designer gown as if brushing away something unclean. She had won. Everyone in the room knew it. Everyone except the man at the altar. Alexander Hale had been facing forward when it happened. His back to the crowd, his attention on the officiant, his mind on the vows he was about to exchange with a woman he did not love for an alliance he no longer believed in. He had heard the slap before he understood it. The sound had cut through his thoughts like a blade, and by the time he turned, Victoria's hand was still raised, and Elena Brooks was still standing with her palm pressed to her unborn child. He took in the scene in a single glance, the shattered glass, the red mark blooming on the waitress's cheek, Victoria's triumphant posture, his bride frozen at the head table with her mouth open and her eyes wide, Gideon already stepping forward from the front row, reading the shift in his employer's expression and preparing for whatever came next. The music had stopped. Someone had signaled the quartet, or perhaps the musicians had simply understood that the moment demanded silence. Either way, the only sound in the room now was the soft rustle of fabric as 300 guests leaned forward, straining to see what Alexander Hale would do. Elena noticed him looking. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom, and for a single suspended moment everything else disappeared. She saw something in his gaze that she could not name. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding, or the quiet fury of a man who had just been forced to witness exactly the kind of cruelty he had built his entire code against. He did not look away. Neither did she. Before I take you back to how Elena ended up at this wedding, like this video and drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels because trust me, you're going to want to talk about what happens next. Alexander Hale began to move. He stepped away from the altar, away from his waiting bride, away from the future he had agreed to when he signed contracts and shook hands and promised his empire to a family that saw him as nothing more than a business opportunity. Every step pulled the attention of the room tighter around him, the gravity that bent light itself toward his presence. Victoria's smile faltered. For the first time since she had entered the ballroom, uncertainty flickered across her features. She had expected outrage, confusion, perhaps even a private confrontation later, behind closed doors where Alexander would express his disappointment in measured tones before ultimately doing nothing. She had not expected him to walk toward her. Not like this, not with 300 witnesses and a bride waiting and 20 years of alliances hanging in the balance. But to understand what happened next, and why it shocked every single guest, we need to go back 12 hours, to the moment Elena Brooks made the worst decision of her life. 12 hours earlier, Elena Brooks stood in her kitchen and counted the bills on her counter for the third time that morning. The numbers had not changed. They never did. Rent due in 6 days. Electric past due by 2 weeks. A payment plan with the obstetrician that she was already behind on stretched thin across monthly installments she could barely afford. The math refused to cooperate no matter how many times she rearranged it in her head, no matter how many meals she skipped or hours she picked up or corners she cut, until there were no corners left. Her apartment occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The wallpaper in the hallway peeled at the edges, curling away from walls that had absorbed generations of cooking smells and whispered arguments. The radiator clanked and hissed through the winter months, producing more noise than heat. The floorboards creaked in a pattern she had memorized, a geography of sound that told her exactly where she stood even in complete darkness. But Elena kept the space clean, immaculate even. The second-hand furniture was arranged with care. The windows, though draughty, were washed until they gleamed. A small vase on the kitchen table held fresh flowers she bought from the corner bodega every Sunday. Her one indulgence, her single refusal to let poverty strip away every trace of beauty from her life. The sonogram photo hung on her refrigerator, held in place by a magnet shaped like a sunflower. She looked at it now, the grainy image of a life growing inside her, 24 weeks. A daughter, the technician had told her. Healthy, strong heartbeat, everything developing exactly as it should. The baby's father had left 11 weeks ago. No warning, no explanation, just a note on the kitchen counter and an empty closet where his clothes used to hang. He had taken his things and his promises and vanished into a future that no longer included her. Eleanor had cried for 3 days. On the 4th day, she got up, washed her face and started looking for extra shifts. Her phone rang. She recognized the number. Maggie Russo, head of an elite catering company that serviced events Elena would never attend as a guest. Political fundraisers, corporate galas, private parties at estates with gates and security checkpoints and guest lists that read like a who's who of American power. Elena had worked for Maggie twice before. Both times had paid well. Both times had required her to pretend she was furniture. "I need someone tonight," Maggie said without preamble. Her voice was clipped, efficient, the voice of a woman who had built a business on discretion and reliability. "Last minute. One of my girls called in sick, and I cannot be short-staffed for this event." Elena glanced at the bills on her counter. "What's the rate?" "Triple cash." "But, Eleanor, I need to be clear with you about something." The pause stretched long enough to make Elena's stomach tighten. "These people are different," Maggie continued. "The client pays a premium for privacy. You show up early. You keep your head down, you serve champagne and clear plates, and pretend you don't see anything, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear. You understand?" Elena understood more than Maggie knew. She had grown up in neighborhoods where certain questions were never asked, and certain answers were never given, where you learned to look away at the right moments and forget faces that preferred not to be remembered. "I can do that." You're 6 months pregnant. I need to know you can handle 8 hours on your feet. I can handle it. Another pause. Eleanor could hear Maggie weighing the options, calculating the risk of hiring a pregnant woman against the certainty of being understaffed at an event where mistakes were not tolerated. Waterfront estate, Long Island. A car will pick you up at 4. Wear the standard uniform, black shoes, hair pulled back. You'll be serving during the ceremony and reception. The event should wrap by midnight, but plan for later. Eleanor did the math in her head. Triple rate for 8 hours. Enough to cover rent and electric with money left over. Enough to catch up on the payment plan. Enough to breathe for the first time in weeks. I'll be ready. She ended the call and stood in her kitchen for a long moment, phone still warm in her hand. Through the window she could see the fire escape of the building next door, draped with laundry that would freeze before it dried. A pigeon landed on the railing, regarded her with one suspicious eye, and flew away. Her mother had worked 3 jobs. Elena remembered falling asleep to the sound of the front door opening and closing at odd hours. Her mother coming home from one shift only to leave for another. She remembered the way her mother's hands had looked, rough and red and never quite still, always reaching for the next task, the next responsibility, the next problem that needed solving. Her mother had never begged, never asked for help from people who would make her feel small for needing it. She had raised Elena alone, in apartments not so different from this one, and she had done it with her head held high and her dignity intact. Elena touched her stomach, felt the flutter of movement beneath her palm. Her daughter, restless and alive and counting on her, she walked to her closet and pulled out the black uniform, pressed and cleaned, hanging in plastic from the dry cleaner. She laid it on her bed and began to pack her work bag, comfortable shoes with worn soles, hair ties, a granola bar for the long hours, a small bottle of water. 8 hours of invisibility, that was all she had to survive. 8 hours of being no one, seeing nothing, serving champagne to people who would never learn her name. She had done it before. She would do it again. She told herself it was just one night. She had no idea she was about to walk into the most dangerous wedding in the city, or that the groom had been watching her from the moment she arrived. The Hale estate stretched across 12 acres of Long Island waterfront, a monument to power built on foundations most people preferred not to examine too closely. Black cars lined the private road leading to the main house. Mercedes, Bentleys, Rolls-Royces with tinted windows and drivers who knew better than to make small talk. They arrived in a steady procession throughout the afternoon, depositing guests at the entrance before gliding away to a parking area hidden behind manicured hedges. 300 invitations had been sent. 300 responses had come back affirmative. No one declined an invitation from Alexander Hale. Armed security moved through the grounds in tailored suits, indistinguishable from the valets and the catering staff. They wore earpieces disguised as hearing aids, and carried weapons concealed beneath jackets cut specifically to hide the bulge. Their eyes never stopped moving. They tracked every arrival, every interaction, every subtle shift in body language that might signal trouble before it materialized. The ceremony would take place in the grand ballroom overlooking the water. The reception would follow on the terrace and the adjacent lawn, where white tents had been erected and strung with thousands of lights that would glow like fallen stars once the sun set. Every detail had been planned with precision. Every contingency had been accounted for. Nothing would go wrong tonight. Nothing was supposed to go wrong. 1 hour before the ceremony, Alexander Hale stood alone in his study on the 3rd floor of the main house. The room was lined with books he had actually read, a rarity among men of his stature. First editions of philosophy and history, poetry that he would never admit to loving in public. A lifetime of thought preserved on shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. He was not looking at the books. He was looking out the window, past the arriving guests and the scurrying staff and the carefully constructed theatre of celebration. His gaze rested on the water. The Long Island Sound stretched grey and endless toward a horizon that promised nothing. Alexander was 44 years old. Silver had begun to appear at his temples in the last 2 years, a concession to time that he refused to hide with dye or vanity. His face carried the evidence of decades spent making decisions that other men could not stomach. Lines around his eyes, a set to his jaw that rarely softened, the posture of someone who had learned long ago that relaxation was a luxury he could not afford. He had built an empire, inherited a fragment of it from his father, yes, but the rest he had constructed himself, deal by deal, year by year, alliance by alliance. He had taken a regional operation and expanded it into something that reached from the eastern seaboard to the Gulf Coast. Something that employed thousands of people and influenced industries and moved money in quantities that required their own accounting departments. And he had done it with a code, a principle that he had sworn to himself he would never abandon. no matter how inconvenient it became. Power must never excuse cruelty. The door opened behind him. He did not turn, he already knew who it was. Only one person entered his study without knocking. Everything is in place. Gideon Cole's voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had spent 15 years anticipating problems before they arose. The families are here. The Whitfields arrived 20 minutes ago. Serena is getting ready in the East Wing.
Alexander nodded but did not respond. The officiant has been briefed.
Security is positioned. The catering team passed all background checks. Gideon paused. It's happening, Alexander. In 1 hour, the alliance will be sealed. The alliance. That was the word they used, the polite term for what this wedding actually represented. Serena Whitfield was beautiful, intelligent, accomplished in her own right. She came from a family that had opposed Alexander's expansion for nearly a decade. A cold war fought through intermediaries and proxies, and the occasional display of force that never quite escalated into open conflict. The marriage would end that war. It would merge two empires into something larger than either could achieve alone. It would secure Alexander's legacy and guarantee stability for a generation. It would also chain him to a woman he did not love for the rest of his life. He had agreed to the arrangement 18 months ago, signed the contracts, shaken the hands, made the promises that men in his position were expected to make. Somewhere along the way, the code he had built his life around had become compromise. The compromises had become chains. This wedding was the final link. "Are you ready?" Gideon asked. Alexander finally turned from the window. His expression revealed nothing. Ready has nothing to do with it. Gideon studied him for a moment, reading the tension that Alexander kept carefully contained. They had known each other too long for pretense. There's one more thing. Victoria Ashford is here. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Almost. She was on the guest list, he said. The Whitfields insisted. Old family connections. She arrived late, made an entrance. She's wearing a gown that's drawing more attention than the bride's. Victoria always did enjoy being seen. She could be a problem.
Alexander shook his head.
He moved away from the window and toward the door, preparing to descend into the performance that awaited him. The guests, the ceremony, the vows he would speak to a woman whose hand he would hold without feeling anything at all. Victoria is the past, he said. Whatever she came here for, it doesn't concern me anymore. She made her choices, I made mine. Tonight is about the future. He said it with certainty, with the confidence of a man who had spent 20 years reading people and situations and emerging victorious from conflicts that would have destroyed lesser men. He was wrong. Victoria Ashford had not come to watch him get married. She had come to destroy everything, starting with the one person Alexander had not even noticed yet. The black car deposited Elena at the service entrance behind the main house, far from the grand circular driveway where guests arrived in vehicles worth more than her annual income. She stepped out into the late afternoon light and felt the weight of the place immediately. The Hale estate radiated money in a way that went beyond the obvious displays of wealth. It lived in the perfectly maintained grounds, the discreet security cameras hidden among the landscaping, the staff members who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that mistakes here carried consequences. Elena had worked events at expensive venues before, but this was different. This was power concentrated into 12 acres of waterfront property, and every blade of grass seemed aware of it. Maggie Russo gathered the catering team in a staging area adjacent to the kitchen. 12 servers in identical black uniforms, hair pulled back, expressions neutral. Elena recognized a few faces from previous events. No one spoke beyond brief nods of acknowledgement. They all understood the rules. "Listen carefully," Maggie said, her voice low and precise. "This is not a normal event. The people in that ballroom are not normal guests. You will stay invisible. You will not make eye contact unless directly addressed. You will not speak unless spoken to. You will not react to anything you see or hear, no matter what it is. If someone drops a glass, you clean it up without expression. If someone raises their voice, you continue serving without acknowledgement. Your job is to be furniture that moves. Do you understand?" 12 heads nodded in unison. Champagne service begins in 20 minutes. Stations are assigned. Elena, you're covering the main hall and the area near the head table. Stay alert, stay quiet, stay invisible. Elena took her position as the guests began filtering into the ballroom. She held her tray of champagne flutes, with practiced steadiness, moving along the edges of the room, offering drinks with a polite smile that invited no conversation. Her feet already ached from the thin soles of her work shoes, and the baby had shifted into a position that pressed against her lower back. 8 hours. She could survive 8 hours. The guests were unlike anyone she had encountered in her regular life. She recognized faces from magazine covers and news broadcasts, a senator who had recently announced his re-election campaign, a tech billionaire whose company had been in the headlines for months, a woman whose family name adorned museum wings and hospital buildings across the eastern seaboard. These were not merely wealthy people. These were people who shaped policy, who influenced markets, who made phone calls that changed the trajectories of nations. Elena moved among them like a ghost, present but unnoticed, close enough to hear fragments of conversation that meant nothing to her. Mergers and acquisitions, political appointments, summer plans that involved private islands and chartered yachts, a world so removed from her own that it might as well have existed on another planet. She was refilling her tray near the service station when she saw him for the first time. Alexander Hale stood near the centre of the ballroom, surrounded by guests who competed for his attention without appearing to compete at all. He was taller than she had expected, with silver at his temples and a stillness about him that set him apart from the performative energy of everyone else in the room. The other guests moved constantly, gesturing, laughing, positioning themselves. Alexander simply stood, and somehow, despite his stillness, every eye in his vicinity kept drifting back to him. Elena did not know who he was. She only knew that he moved through the crowd differently than anyone else. He did not seek attention. He commanded it without effort, a gravity that pulled people into his orbit whether they intended to fall or not. Their eyes met across the room. The contact lasted half a second, perhaps less, a flicker of connection across 30 feet of marble floor and 300 bodies. Eleanor looked away first, heat rising to her cheeks as she reminded herself of Maggie's instructions. Invisible. Furniture. She was furniture that moved and poured champagne and did not meet the eyes of men who could buy her apartment building without noticing the expense. She returned to her station and tried to forget the moment had happened. 10 minutes later, Victoria Ashford arrived. The entrance was deliberate, calculated. Victoria paused at the ballroom doors long enough to ensure every guest had registered her presence before gliding into the room with the confidence of someone who believed she belonged at the centre of every gathering. Her gown was a deep emerald that caught the light with each step, more striking than the bride's ivory, more memorable than any other dress in the room. Whispers followed her like a wake behind a ship. Elena did not know the history. She only saw the reaction, the way certain guests leaned together to murmur behind their hands, the way others looked quickly at Alexander and then away, the sudden tension that rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. Victoria moved through the crowd, accepting greetings and compliments with the practiced grace of a woman accustomed to admiration. Her path seemed random, but Elena noticed that it curved steadily toward where Alexander stood with his bride-to-be. And then Victoria's gaze found Elena. The look lasted only a moment, a flicker of attention from across the room, eyes travelling from Elena's face to her pregnant belly and back again. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach, a warning she could not explain. Victoria smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Elena did not understand what had just happened. She only knew that something had shifted, some invisible line had been crossed, and she was suddenly no longer invisible at all. Victoria Ashford stood at the edge of the ballroom and watched the ceremony preparations with a smile that never reached her eyes. The florists made final adjustments to the arrangements near the altar. The string quartet tuned their instruments with quiet precision. Staff members moved through the space with last-minute touches, straightening chairs, polishing already gleaming surfaces, ensuring that every detail met the impossible standards expected at an event of this magnitude. In 30 minutes, Alexander Hale would stand at that altar and promise himself to another woman. Victoria accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server and let the familiar bitterness settle into her bones. 3 years ago, she had been the one planning this wedding. She had visited this estate as Alexander's partner, as the woman who would become Mrs. Hale as the future matriarch of an empire that stretched across the eastern seaboard. She had picked out her dress. She had told her friends. She had already begun redecorating the master bedroom in her mind, imagining the life they would build together in these halls. 2 years of her life. 2 years of positioning herself as the perfect companion for a man of his stature. 2 years of attending the right events, wearing the right clothes, saying the right things to the right people. She had invested everything in Alexander Hale. Her time, her energy, her future. And he had ended it with a single sentence. We want different things. No warning, no negotiation. No opportunity to defend herself or change his mind. He had simply looked at her across the breakfast table one morning, spoken those 4 words, and walked away from 2 years without a backward glance. Victoria had demanded an explanation. She had raged and wept and threatened. She had called him a coward, a fool, a man who would never find anyone who understood him the way she did. None of it had moved him. Alexander Hale had made his decision, and Alexander Hale did not reverse his decision. It had taken her months to piece together what had actually happened, to understand the real reason behind his sudden departure. The housekeeper. That was where it started. A woman named Rosa who had worked at the estate for 15 years. Victoria had snapped at her during a dinner party, mocking her accent in front of guests when she mispronounced a wine name. A small moment. A tiny cruelty that Victoria had forgotten by the time dessert was served. Alexander had not forgotten. Then there was the driver. A wrong turn on the way to a charity gala had made them 7 minutes late, and Victoria had berated him for the entire remaining journey, called him incompetent, threatened to have him fired, made him apologize 3 times before she was satisfied.
Alexander had watched. Alexander had remembered.
Small cruelties. That was what he had called them when she finally cornered him and demanded the truth. Small cruelties that revealed a large truth about who she really was. He had built his empire on a code, he told her. Power must never excuse cruelty, and Victoria believed that power entitled her to treat lesser people however she wished. She had laughed at him, called his code naive, told him that everyone in their world understood the natural order of things, that servants existed to serve, and if they could not perform their duties without error, they deserved whatever correction they received. Alexander had looked at her with something worse than anger, something worse than disgust. He had looked at her with disappointment, and that was the last time they had spoken. Victoria never recovered, not from the heartbreak. She had experienced heartbreak before and survived. What she could not survive was the humiliation, the whispers that followed her through every social event, the pitying looks from women she considered beneath her, the knowledge that Alexander Hale had examined her soul and found it wanting. She had tried to move on, dated other men, attended other parties, built a new life that did not include him, but everywhere she went, his shadow followed. His rejection had marked her, branded her as a woman who had failed to measure up to his impossible standards. Now she stood in his ballroom, watching him prepare to marry someone else, and the rage that had been building for 3 years threatened to consume her entirely. She had not come here to make a scene. She had told herself that on the drive over. She had dressed carefully, chosen a gown that would remind Alexander of everything he had discarded, and prepared a performance of gracious indifference that would prove she had moved beyond him. She wanted him to see her thriving, wanted him to regret his decision, wanted him to lie awake at night wondering what might have been. But watching him now, watching the way he moved through his own wedding with that infuriating calm, watching the respect and fear he commanded from every person in the room, something inside Victoria shifted. She did not want his regret. She wanted his pain. Her eyes drifted across the ballroom, searching for weakness, searching for opportunity, and that was when she noticed the pregnant waitress. The girl was young, mid-20s at most. She moved along the edges of the room with a tray of champagne, unremarkable in her black uniform, invisible the way servants were supposed to be invisible. But Victoria had seen something that the other guests had missed. She had seen Alexander's eyes find the waitress across the crowded room. She had seen him pause, just for a moment, his attention caught by something in the girl's face or posture or bearing. It had lasted less than a second. Anyone else would have dismissed it as nothing. Victoria knew better. If you're already invested in where this is going, hit that like button now, because Victoria is about to do something that changes everything, and I need you locked in for what comes next. Alexander Hale had a weakness. He protected people he considered innocent. He championed those he saw as victims of cruelty. It was his code, his sacred principle, the foundation upon which he had built his entire self-image. Victoria could use that. She watched the waitress refill her tray and return to the floor, pregnant, vulnerable, completely unaware of the attention she had attracted. If Victoria struck at her, publicly, undeniably, Alexander would be forced to respond. And in responding, he would reveal himself. He would show everyone at his own wedding that he cared more about a random servant than he did about the alliances and appearances and political calculations that were supposed to matter most. He would humiliate himself. He would humiliate his bride. He would undo years of careful positioning for the sake of a woman who meant nothing, and Victoria would finally have her revenge. She finished her champagne and set the empty glass on a passing tray. Her path toward the head table was already forming in her mind. She would wait until the reception, wait until the room was full and watching, wait until the moment of maximum impact. Victoria smiled. She had found the perfect weapon, not a gun. not a secret. Just a pregnant waitress who did not know she had already been marked. The string quartet began to play, and 300 guests rose from their seats in unison. Serena Whitfield appeared at the entrance to the ballroom on her father's arm. Her gown was a masterpiece of silk and lace, hand-sewn by designers whose names appeared in fashion magazines and whose waiting lists stretched for years. The dress alone was worth more than Elena would earn in 5 years of catering shifts, perhaps 10. The veil trailed behind her like a whisper, catching the late afternoon light that streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was beautiful. Everyone in the room could see that. She moved with the practiced grace of a woman who had been prepared for this moment since childhood. Each step measured, each gesture refined. The guests watched her approach the altar with expressions of admiration and approval. This was a union that made sense. Two powerful families joining together. Two empires becoming one. Alexander stood at the altar, waiting. His expression remained unreadable. Whatever he felt about the woman walking toward him, about the vows he was about to speak, about the future he was about to seal, none of it showed on his face. He had spent decades mastering the art of revealing nothing, and today was no exception. Gideon Cole sat in the front row, his eyes moving constantly across the room. He tracked the security personnel positioned at each exit. He noted the placement of every server, every guest, every potential threat. His job was to anticipate problems before they materialized, to see danger in the spaces between moments. He was very good at his job. He did not notice Victoria Ashford repositioning herself near the service area at the back of the room. Elena continued her work along the edges of the ballroom. She had set down her tray during the ceremony, standing quietly against the wall with the other servers, waiting for the moment when champagne would be needed again. Her feet throbbed with a dull ache that had settled into her bones. Her lower back complained with each small shift of her weight. The baby kicked against her ribs, restless and active, unaware of the world her mother was navigating. 4 more hours, maybe 5. Elena focused on the numbers. The money she would collect at the end of the night, the bills she would pay, the relief of catching up, even temporarily, on the debts that had been suffocating her for months. She just had to get through the next few hours. Stay invisible. Stay quiet. Go home. The officiant spoke words about love and commitment and partnership. Elena had heard similar words at other weddings, other ceremonies where she had stood at the margins and watched strangers promise themselves to each other. She did not listen closely. The words were not meant for her. Her gaze drifted across the room and found Alexander at the altar. He was already looking at her. The contact lasted only a moment, a flicker of connection across the crowded space, brief enough that anyone watching might have missed it entirely. Something moved across his face, an expression Elena could not name, could not interpret, could only feel as a strange flutter beneath her ribs that had nothing to do with the baby. Elena felt heat rise to her cheeks. She stared at the floor, reminding herself of every rule Maggie had given. Invisible, silent, furniture that breathed. She was not supposed to exist in this room, not supposed to be noticed, certainly not supposed to catch the eye of the groom during his own wedding vows. The officiant pronounced them married. Applause erupted through the ballroom, 300 guests celebrating the union they had gathered to witness. Alexander kissed his bride, brief, appropriate, devoid of passion that Eleanor could detect from her position against the wall. Serena smiled the smile of a woman who had achieved exactly what she set out to achieve. Victoria clapped with everyone else. Her hands came together in a rhythm that matched the crowd, her expression one of polished congratulations, but her eyes never left Elena. The reception began. Guests rose from their seats and migrated toward the terrace and the lawn beyond, where cocktails waited and the evening's real socializing would commence. Servers retrieved their trays and resumed their positions. Elena collected fresh glasses of champagne and prepared to return to the floor. Maggie intercepted her near the service station. Change of assignment. You're covering the head table now. Bride and groom's area. Keep their glasses full and stay attentive. Elena nodded. The head table was a prestigious assignment. More visible than the edges of the room, but also more likely to generate better tips if the right people noticed her attentiveness. She did not question the reassignment. She simply adjusted her tray and made her way toward the front of the ballroom. She did not know that Victoria Ashford had requested her specifically. She did not know that she was walking directly into a trap. Eleanor approached the head table with her tray balanced carefully in both hands. 6 glasses of champagne arranged in a precise formation, catching the light from the chandeliers above. She moved with the quiet efficiency that years of catering work had taught her, head slightly bowed, steps measured, expression neutral, exactly the way Maggie had instructed. Exactly, invisible. The head table gleamed with crystal and silver. The bride sat at its center, radiant in her gown, accepting congratulations from a steady stream of well-wishers. The groom sat beside her, his attention divided between the guests who demanded acknowledgement and something distant that Elena could not identify. She did not look at him directly. She had learned her lesson earlier. Eye contact was dangerous in rooms like this. She was 3 steps from the table when Victoria Ashford intercepted her. "You there?" "Waitress." Elena stopped. The voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. She turned, arranged her features into the polite, empty expression that served as warlike armor, and faced the woman in the emerald gown. "Yes, ma'am?" Victoria studied her with an intensity that made Elena's skin prickle. Those eyes travelled slowly from Elena's face to her pregnant belly to her worn shoes. The ones with thin soles that had carried her through hundreds of events but had never quite been replaced, and back up again. The examination was deliberate, invasive, designed to make Elena feel every inch of the distance between them. "You look familiar." Victoria's voice carried a false warmth that did not reach her eyes. "Have we met?" Eleanor shook her head. She had never seen this woman before tonight. She would have remembered. There was something about Victoria Ashford that imprinted itself on memory, a sharpness beneath the polished surface that warned of danger. "I don't think so, ma'am." "Are you sure?" Victoria took a step closer. Her perfume was expensive, overwhelming, a cloud of scent that seemed designed to remind everyone nearby exactly how much money she represented. "Because I never forget a face, especially not one that doesn't belong." The last words were louder than necessary. They carried across the nearby tables, drawing the attention of guests who had been engaged in their own conversations, heads turned. Whispers began. Elena felt the weight of gazes landing on her like physical pressure, dozens of eyes suddenly aware of her existence, in a room where she was supposed to be invisible. Her grip tightened on the tray. The champagne glasses trembled slightly, liquid catching light as it shifted. "I'm just here to serve, ma'am." Elena kept her voice steady, professional, betraying none of the alarm that had begun to build in her chest. "If you'll excuse me." She never finished the sentence. The slap came without warning. Victoria's palm connected with Elena's cheek in a single explosive motion. The crack of skin against skin rang out across the ballroom, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through conversation and music and the ambient noise of 300 guests enjoying an evening of celebration. The sound seemed to echo, to multiply, to fill every corner of the vast space until there was nothing else. Elena's head snapped to the right. The force of the blow sent her stumbling, her careful balance destroyed in an instant. The tray slipped from her fingers. Champagne glasses tumbled through the air in a cascade of crystal and golden liquid, shattering against the marble floor with a sound like breaking ice. Shards scattered across the polished stone, glittering in the chandelier light like fragments of a destroyed world. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. 300 people inhaled at once, shock rippling through the room in a wave that seemed to suspend time itself. Eleanor caught herself before she fell. One hand flew to her belly, instinct overriding everything else, protecting the life inside her even as humiliation burned through her veins like acid. Her cheek throbbed with heat that spread down her neck and into her chest. She could feel the mark forming, the red imprint of Victoria's hand blooming across her skin like a brand. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were a luxury she could not afford. Not in front of people like this, not when showing weakness would only invite more cruelty. Victoria stood over her, hand still raised, expression triumphant. She had achieved exactly what she wanted. The entire room was watching. Every guest, every server, every security guard had their eyes fixed on the scene unfolding near the head table. This was her moment, her revenge. Her demonstration that she could still command attention, still exercise power, still matter in Alexander Hale's world. "You don't belong here," Victoria said. Her voice dripped with venom, with satisfaction, with the certainty of a woman who believed she had already won, and neither does that. Her gaze dropped pointedly to Elena's stomach, to the visible curve beneath the uniform, to the child who would be born into a world where women like Victoria Ashford could strike pregnant strangers without consequence. The room remained frozen. Guests stood like statues, champagne glasses suspended, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. No one moved to help. No one spoke in Elena's defense. The security guards along the walls stayed at their posts, uncertain whether this qualified as the kind of threat they had been trained to address. The other servers had retreated, melting into the background, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. Elena was alone. She straightened slowly, keeping one hand on her belly, keeping her expression as neutral as she could manage despite the fire in her cheek and the shame coursing through her body. She had been here before, not in this exact moment, but in moments like it. Moments when powerful people reminded her of her place. Moments when she was expected to apologize for the crime of existing in spaces that did not welcome her. The words were already forming on her lips. "I'm sorry. It was my fault. Please forgive me." But then the music stopped. The string quartet fell silent mid-measure, bows freezing above strings, the final notes hanging in the air like a question without an answer. The sudden absence of sound was almost more shocking than the slap itself, a void that seemed to pull all remaining noise into its centre. Alexander Hale had turned from his bride. He stood at the head table, having risen from his seat in a motion so controlled that Elena had not noticed until this moment. His eyes took in the scene with a single sweeping glance: the shattered glass, the scattered champagne, the woman in the emerald gown with her hand still raised in triumph, the pregnant waitress with the red mark spreading across her cheek. Victoria saw his expression and felt something cold slide through her stomach. She had expected anger. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected him to manage the situation quietly, to have security escort Elena away, to smooth things over with his guests and return to his wedding celebration as if nothing had happened. She had not expected what she saw in his eyes now. For the first time in 3 years, Victoria Ashford looked at Alexander Hale and felt genuine fear. Every guest held their breath, because Alexander Hale was not looking at his new wife. He was not looking at Victoria. He was looking at the pregnant waitress with the red mark spreading across her cheek. And when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that people in the back had to lean forward to hear. But what he said, it echoed through that room like a gunshot. Alexander Hale began to move. He stepped away from the head table with a deliberate calm that seemed to slow time itself. Each footfall against the marble floor rang out in the silence, measured and unhurried, the walk of a man who had never needed to rush in his life. The crowd parted before him without conscious thought, guests stepping aside as if pulled by invisible strings, creating a clear path between him and the two women standing amid shattered glass and spilled champagne. Every eye in the room followed him. 300 guests held their breath, their champagne, their half-formed thoughts. Even the security guards along the walls stood frozen, uncertain whether to intervene in something that had moved beyond their training. This was not a threat they knew how to address. This was something else entirely. Gideon Cole rose from his seat in the front row, his hand instinctively moving toward the concealed weapon beneath his jacket. 15 years of anticipating problems. 15 years of reading his employer's intentions before they became actions, and he had no idea what Alexander was about to do. The uncertainty unsettled him more than any visible danger could have. Alexander stopped in front of Victoria Ashford. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch her. He simply stood there, close enough that she could see every detail of his expression, close enough that the weight of his presence pressed against her like a physical force. "Leave." The word was quiet, almost gentle. It carried no heat, no visible anger, nothing that Victoria could use to dismiss it as an emotional outburst. It was simply a command, issued by a man who had spent 20 years giving commands that people obeyed without question. Victoria laughed. The sound came out nervous, brittle, nothing like the confident amusement she had intended. She had prepared for anger. She had prepared for a scene. She had not prepared for this cold, quiet certainty. "Alexander, darling, I was just..." Now. The second word landed harder than the first. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, an invisible chill that had nothing to do with the climate control and everything to do with the man standing at its centre. This was no longer a request. This was no longer a suggestion. This was a decree from someone who had built an empire on the understanding that his decrees were absolute. Victoria's composure cracked. She could feel it happening, could feel the careful mask she had constructed beginning to fracture under the pressure of 300 watching gazes. This was not how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be embarrassed. He was supposed to manage the situation quietly, to protect his wedding, to choose his alliances over a nobody. "You're going to embarrass yourself over a waitress?" Her voice rose, desperation bleeding through the carefully cultivated elegance. "Over some pregnant stranger who doesn't even..." "I said leave." Alexander did not move, did not raise his hand, did not change his tone, but something in his eyes shifted, and Victoria felt the last of her defiance crumble. She had seen that look before. 3 years ago across a breakfast table, when he had ended their relationship with 4 words and an expression that told her everything she needed to know about his opinion of her soul. She should have walked away. Pride demanded that she hold her ground, that she refuse to be dismissed like a misbehaving servant, that she remind him who she was and what she represented. but her legs would not obey. Her voice would not come. For the first time in her adult life, Victoria Ashford found herself completely and utterly powerless. She did not move. Alexander turned away from her as if she had already ceased to exist. He faced the assembled guests, 300 of the most powerful and influential people on the eastern seaboard, all of them watching him with expressions that ranged from shock to horror to a kind of morbid fascination. His bride stood frozen at the head table, her perfect makeup beginning to smear with tears she had not yet realized she was crying. Her father had risen from his seat, face red with a fury he did not dare express. "This wedding is over," gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs spread like fire through dry grass. Somewhere near the back of the room, someone dropped a glass, the shattering sound barely registering against the enormity of what had just been spoken. Years of negotiation, months of planning. An alliance that was supposed to secure two empires for another generation. All of it dissolving in a single sentence. "Anyone who believes cruelty is acceptable in my presence is no longer welcome in my life." He spoke to the room, but his words carried beyond it. They would be repeated in boardrooms and back channels for months to come. They would be analysed and debated and used to predict his future actions. They would become legend in circles where legends mattered. Alexander removed his jacket. The motion was simple, unhurried, as deliberate as every other action he had taken in the past 2 minutes. He walked toward Elena, who still stood amid the wreckage of shattered glass, her hand pressed to her belly, her cheek marked with the red imprint of Victoria's fury. He offered her the jacket. Not as possession, not as spectacle, not as a claim or a statement or a calculated move in some larger game. He offered it as protection, as a simple human gesture from one person to another, as the acknowledgement that she had been wronged and that someone had noticed. Elena looked at him. Her eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She did not understand what was happening, did not understand why this man she had never met was dismantling his own wedding on her behalf, but she understood the jacket. She understood what it meant to be seen. She took it. Alexander turned to Gideon, who had moved closer during the confrontation, positioning himself within arm's reach of his employer. "Call her a car. Make sure she gets home safely." Gideon nodded once, already reaching for his phone. Alexander walked toward the ballroom doors. He did not look at Victoria, who had finally found the strength to move, and was now trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go. He did not look at Serena, whose sobs had become audible, whose perfect day had become a catastrophe she would never fully recover from. He did not look at the family heads from both sides, who had risen from their seats and were shouting questions and demands that he did not acknowledge. He walked out the door and did not look back. Chaos erupted in his wake. Victoria's screams tore through the stunned silence, accusations and obscenities pouring from her in a torrent that stripped away every pretense of elegance she had cultivated. Serena collapsed into her mother's arms, her wedding dress pooling around her like a failed promise. The Whitfield patriarch stormed toward the door, demanding that Alexander return and explain himself. The Hale family representatives moved to intercept him, and within seconds 2 decades of carefully maintained peace threatened to shatter completely. Staff members scrambled to respond. Security guards spoke urgently into their earpieces, requesting instructions that no one was prepared to give. The string quartet sat motionless, their instruments silent, unwilling to play a single note in the aftermath of destruction. Elena stood at the centre of it all, wrapped in Alexander Hale's jacket, watching the most powerful families on the eastern seaboard tear themselves apart around her. She still did not understand what had happened. She only knew that a man she had never met had looked at her, seen her, and chosen to burn down his world rather than allow her humiliation to stand. "I need to know, do you think Alexander made the right call? Destroying years of alliances, walking away from his own wedding, all because of what happened to a waitress he had never met?" Drop your answer in the comments right now, because what happens next proves exactly what kind of man he really is. The black car moved through the darkness in silence. Elena sat in the back seat, still wrapped in Alexander Hale's jacket, watching the lights of Long Island blur past the tinted windows. Her cheek had stopped throbbing, but she could still feel the phantom pressure of Victoria's palm against her skin. The humiliation had faded into something else now, a kind of numb disbelief that made the entire evening feel like a fever dream. Gideon Cole drove with the focused attention of a man who had navigated far more dangerous situations than a quiet ride through suburban streets. He had not spoken since helping her into the car, giving her space to process what had happened, but Elena could feel questions building inside her, pressing against the silence until she could no longer contain them. Who is he? Gideon's eyes met hers briefly in the rearview mirror before returning to the road. He seemed to weigh his response carefully, choosing words with the precision of someone accustomed to managing sensitive information. Alexander Hale is one of the most powerful men on the eastern seaboard. His influence extends into industries most people don't even know exist. The wedding tonight was a political arrangement between his family and the Whitfields. The marriage was supposed to end a decade of conflict and secure alliances that would have reshaped the balance of power for a generation. Elena absorbed this slowly. She had known the guests at the wedding were important. She had sensed the weight of the event, the gravity that pressed down on everyone who entered that ballroom, but she had not understood the scale of what she had witnessed. And he walked away from all of that. Yes, because of me? Gideon was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, losing some of its professional distance. He did that because of what she did. There's a difference. You didn't cause anything tonight. Victoria Ashford made a choice. Alexander made his in response. The consequences belong to them, not to you. Elena looked down at the jacket wrapped around her shoulders. The fabric was expensive, finely tailored, carrying a faint scent that she could not identify but that seemed to belong to the man who had worn it. She thought about the way he had crossed the room, the way he had spoken without raising his voice, the way 300 people had fallen silent at his approach. She thought about the way he had looked at her. Miles away, Alexander Hale stood alone on the grounds of his estate, staring out at the dark waters of the Long Island Sound. The chaos had subsided. The guests had departed, some in outrage, some in confusion, some with expressions of barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing the fall of a man they had envied for years. Serena had been escorted away by her family, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a ghost. Victoria had disappeared. Though Alexander knew he had not seen the last of her, the Whitfield patriarch had made threats that were not empty. None of it mattered. Gideon found him by the water, approaching with the quiet footsteps of a man who had learned long ago when to speak and when to simply be present. The families are already mobilizing. The Whitfields are calling in favors. Your father's old allies are choosing sides. Alexander did not turn. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, on the place where dark water met darker sky. I expected as much. Do you understand what you've done? You've undone 20 years of work in 60 seconds. Everything you built, everything your father built before you, it's all in jeopardy now. Over a stranger, over someone you've never even spoken to. Alexander was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with regret. I built everything on one principle. Power must never excuse cruelty. The moment I looked away from that, the moment I allowed someone to be humiliated in my presence because it was convenient to ignore it, I became everything I swore to destroy. And the cost is the cost. I made my choice. I'll live with the consequences. Gideon studied him in the darkness, seeing something in his employer's posture that he had not seen in years, a kind of clarity, a release of tension that had been building so gradually that neither of them had noticed it accumulating. They'll come for you now. The Whitfields won't let this stand. And Victoria, let them come. Alexander finally turned to face him. I've spent too long making compromises I didn't believe in, marrying a woman I didn't love, to secure alliances with people who disgust me. Tonight reminded me who I actually am. Whatever comes next, at least I'll face it honestly. The car pulled to a stop outside Elena's apartment building. The street was quiet, the buildings dark except for scattered windows where other lives continued, unaware of the earthquake that had just reshaped the landscape of power 30 miles away. Eleanor reached for the door handle, then paused. She shrugged off the jacket and held it toward Gideon. Please give this back to him, and tell him. She stopped, unsure what message could possibly be adequate. Tell him thank you. Gideon shook his head. Keep it. He would want you to. She hesitated, then folded the jacket over her arm. As she did, her fingers brushed against something in the inside pocket. A business card. Simple white stock, elegant printing. Just a name and a phone number. No title. No company. Nothing else. Alexander Hale. Eleanor stood on the sidewalk and watched the car disappear around the corner. The night air was cold against her skin, but the jacket was warm in her arms. She looked up at her building. The peeling paint, the flickering hallway light, the life she had been barely surviving. Something had shifted tonight. She could feel it in her bones, in the flutter of movement from the daughter growing inside her. Not love. It was far too soon for that, and she was not foolish enough to mistake gratitude for something deeper. But something like hope. The dangerous kind. The kind that made you believe things could change. The kind that whispered maybe the world was not as cold as it seemed. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, hung Alexander Hale's jacket in her closet, and did not call the number on the card. Not yet. But she kept it. 3 days passed. Elena returned to the quiet rhythm of her life. Morning shifts at a coffee shop downtown, evening catering gigs when she could find them, doctor's appointments where she listened to her daughter's heartbeat and answered questions about her stress levels with careful half-truths. The bills on her kitchen counter had not disappeared, but the payment from the Hale wedding, triple rate, cash, just as Maggie had promised, had bought her breathing room. 2 months of rent, the electric bill cleared, a small cushion against the next emergency. She tried to forget what had happened, tried to file it away as a strange chapter in a life that had already contained its share of strange chapters. She went to work, she came home. She cooked simple meals and talked to her belly and pretended that everything was normal, but word travels. The story of the Hale wedding spread through every social circle in the city. From penthouses to bodegas, from boardrooms to break rooms, people whispered about the waitress who got slapped and the Mafia boss who walked away from his own altar. The details shifted with each retelling. Some versions made Elena a secret lover, others painted her as an innocent bystander caught in a war between powerful families. A few claimed the whole thing had been staged, a calculated move in some larger game that ordinary people could not understand. Everyone asked the same question: why? Why would a man with everything, wealth, power, an alliance that would have secured his empire for decades, throw it all away for a stranger? What had he seen in that moment that made him choose destruction over convenience? What kind of person burned down his own future to defend the dignity of someone he had never met? Elena heard the rumors. She ignored them. She did not want to be a story. She did not want to be the subject of speculation and gossip and theories that had nothing to do with who she actually was. She just wanted to raise her child in peace. She just wanted to survive. Alexander Hale's jacket still hung in her closet. His business card still sat on her nightstand. She had not called. She was not sure she ever would. What would she even say? Thank you for dismantling your life on my behalf. Thank you for seeing me when everyone else looked through me. Some things could not be spoken. They could only be carried. On the 4th day, Elena went to the grocery store. It was a small errand, bread and milk and vegetables for dinner. She moved through the aisles with the distracted efficiency of someone whose mind was elsewhere, adding items to her basket without really seeing them. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A child cried somewhere near the cereal aisle. Life continued in all its ordinary, unremarkable persistence. She was standing in the checkout line when she felt it. Someone was watching her. The sensation prickled across her skin, familiar and strange at once. She turned slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly, her eyes scanning the store for the source of the attention. Alexander Hale stood at the end of the aisle. He was alone. No security, no entourage, no visible markers of the empire, he commanded. Just a man in a simple dark coat standing in a grocery store on a Wednesday afternoon, looking at her like she was the only person in the room. Their eyes met. Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, a rhythm that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with something she could not name. He did not approach, did not speak, did not close the distance between them with words or gestures or explanations. He simply nodded once. A gesture of recognition, of respect, of acknowledgement that what had passed between them, whatever it was, had mattered. Then he turned and walked away. Eleanor stood frozen in the checkout line, groceries forgotten, watching him disappear through the automatic doors and into the afternoon light. She did not know what it meant, did not know if she would ever see him again, but she knew one thing. For the first time in her life, someone powerful had seen her, and instead of looking away, he had burned down his world. Some people say Alexander Hale lost everything that night. His alliance, his bride, his empire's future. But here is what I think. He did not lose anything. He finally found out what he was willing to fight for, and sometimes that is worth more than any empire. The question is, what happens next? That is the story. If it stayed with you, if you are still thinking about what you would have done, drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, ones that stick with you long after they are over, subscribe to this channel, because trust me, we are just getting started.